as we approached the Second World War, Mosley launched a massive anti-war campaign. In other words, he went around the country addressing meetings, explaining that we should not be fighting against Germany again, that this is a mistake, that the French had led us into this sort of a war already in 1914, and we mustn't let them do it again. And of course, he blamed the Jews as well for leading us into a conflict with Germany. But that gave the fascists another really respectable campaign, if you like. Mosley again addressed lots of big meetings on this theme without experiencing heckling and trouble and violence and all the rest of it, because a lot of people were inclined to agree with what he was saying, at least in the sense that they were very, very loath to embark upon another major war.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History pod, and today we're chatting fascists, and British fascists to be exact. Have you ever wondered if your friend, family member or colleague was a fascist? Well, don't worry, after listening to today's episode and the historical perspective, you'll be able to cheerfully label those with evidence. Martin Pugh is the top historian of the British fascists during the 1920s and 30s. Alec Marsh is the author of Rule Britannia, the first of his Drabble and Harris thrillers set in the period, and the three of us delve into whether the fascists could have taken over in Britain, the personalities, why it didn't work, and the present-day politicians who can be compared. Coming up, plenty more great history to come, including Vietnam and the My Lai massacre, the history of conspiracies, Winston Churchill, and much, much more. Please rate and review and subscribe and tell your friends. But until then, I'll hand you over to me talking with Martin Pugh and Alec Marsh on British fascism. Martin Pugh, Alec Marsh, welcome to the podcast. An absolute pleasure to have you both on. We've got a giant, we're talking 1930s and British fascism. So we have the foremost expert in that subject in Martin Pugh. So welcome. And then Alec, you've written a novel about the period, about fascism in your first novel of your Drabble and Harris thrillers. So I just wanted to welcome you. And Martin, your book, Hurrah for the Blackshirts, which is hugely influential. So thank you for joining me. Alec, I wanted to start with you because you've written these, you very kindly introduced Martin into this chat to arrange this meeting. And it's great that you've done that. And the reason why I've done that is because your first novel, as I said, is set during the 1930s. And I just wondered if you could tell the listeners, tell me, why is it that you chose this period to write about? You've written three now, but in particular the fascism of the 30s as well in the UK. Why was that a subject for your rollicking first novel?
Well, I think, it goes to the heart of why the three of us are sitting here talking right now, because back in 2006, 2007, which is nearly 20 years ago now, Martin sent me a copy of Hurrah for the Blackshirts, and he described it, best wishes, and I immediately, like any former student of a historian, sat down and read it from cover to cover, and I loved it. And I have to say, it gave me the spark of the idea of a great moment of jeopardy in our recent history, in the late 1930s, when fascism was on the rise in this country, and we tend to forget this fact. We know that the narrative we all grew up with, and most of us experience now, is the kind of irrepressible dominance of Winston Churchill and Britain standing alone, and all these cliches about our moral superiority and the great escalated victory, and we won, and we're great therefore. But actually, I wanted to explore the fact that we do have this sort of ugly side to our history, which tends to be overlooked, and it was deeper and stronger than we thought. And as I said in my author's note in the novel, Martin's book definitely gave me the thought for that, and it provided a strong MacGuffin, as Hitchcock would have had it, a driving force for the narrative. And I thought, that's exciting. The big counterfactual, what if it had been different, and setting a thriller against that backdrop.
Yes, we'll definitely get on to the what if. Very interested in that. But Martin, can I ask you, the word fascism, what does it mean? What, particularly the period that you're a historian of? How does one define the word fascism?
I think we would usually say that if we want a clear understanding, we really ought to go to Mussolini and the Italian fascists, who sort of helped pioneer the idea of a corporate state. And of course, that's established in the these ideas are there in the 1920s, well before Hitler gets to power, and of course before Sir Oswald Mosley has formed the British Union of Fascists as well. So I think it's the general idea that which a lot of people had between the wars, which was that parliamentary democracy is a kind of decadent system. It's on its way out, and we need to replace it with something. The corporate state is an alternative, which for a fascist ought to be combined with resolute leadership. That's the sort of key, in a sense, resolute leadership and the corporate state.
So when you say corporate state, I just want to understand what you mean by that, because to me that sounds like, companies having weighed quite heavily in favor of large corporations, large companies.
The idea was that instead of representing geographical constituencies as we do, you would represent interests, economic interests, different industries, workers in different industries. And so even women, for example, could be represented under the corporate state as textile workers, which many of them were, but they could also be represented as housewives. This is one of the pitches that 1930s fascists in this country made. So it's the idea of representing people as part of their interest rather than as part of a geographical community.
And how about the sort of nationalist side of things? Because that's, I suppose, our understanding today, particularly when one talks about German and Italian fascists, is that there's that kind of ethno-nationalism that's a big driver. Does that sit well with the definition?
Well, certainly fascist organizations from the 1920s onwards were highly nationalistic. And indeed, part of their pitch was that the what they regarded as the effete, liberal-minded politicians thrown up by the parliamentary system, they're thinking of people like Stanley Baldwin, that these people are not very patriotic and nationalistic. They're letting down the country, not standing up for its interests, giving away bits of the empire, for example. That would be the sort of thing that fascists of all sorts would have said.
Well, you've mentioned Stanley Baldwin there, and I've always been rather a fan of Stanley Baldwin. Alec, I assume he's not the sort of well, obviously Drabble and Harris are the two heroes of the novel, but he's not a third political hero striding across the landscape. He's not a muscular political figure, is he?
No. In fact, Stanley Baldwin doesn't make an appearance in my book. I've got, since there is a strong fascist theme in it, I do have a character who is quite transparently modelled on Sir Oswald Mosley, and he provides he has many of the attributes of Mosley: a passion for militaristic clothing and behaviour. He likes people to be marching in order, and I adopted the lightning bolt logo of the British Union of Fascists for an organisation called the League of the British Empire League of Fascists, which is in my book. But I think, Mosley himself, as this charismatic leader, this righteous leader, he was in British politics for longer than we think. I can't remember actually, Martin. You'll know, but he was still going in the 60s and 70s with different organisations, probably popping up on Parkinson, chit-chatting while smoking cigars or something. Martin, you look like you're about to jump.
Mosley did have a long public career. He was first elected as an MP in 1918, actually. And so he was a Conservative MP, then an independent. Then he joined the Labour Party and was a Labour MP. So, he knew a great deal about the parliamentary politics that he was so critical of. And as you say, he was still active after the Second World War, still fighting a few elections. His organization did, at least. Though, of course, he complained that after the Olympia rally in 1934, the BBC banned him for about 34 years. But he was eventually interviewed again. But it took on the BBC, but it took a very long time.
When we talk about the British Union of Fascists, and I think this is maybe something that perhaps exasperates you, if that's not too strong a word, that we view them as a bit of a joke, famously lampooned as black shorts, and this sort of uniform approach with you've mentioned the flag, and it's all a bit un-British. And they didn't really cause too much of a impact in our parliamentary democracy, and so therefore they weren't really a major threat. And that's not true at all, is it, Martin?
I don't think so. Obviously, some people in the 30s did make fun of the BUF because of the uniforms and the paraphernalia. That's certainly true, and some did say it was not very English or British there. But this is to overlook the fact that the fascist organizations had a number of different ways of participating. So there were alternative organizations. They had, for example, the January Club, which was linked to the BUF, but it was not designed to do street fighting and weapons and all that sort of thing. It had dinners in nice hotels and attracted MPs and peers and even representatives of big British companies. And the idea, of course, was to discuss with them the corporate state as the replacement for parliamentary democracy. Because what Mosley and others were expecting was that at some stage, when they get really invited into power, they will then need allies within the establishment and the political parties and all the rest of it. They'll need allies to help, if you like, ease the transition out of parliamentary democracy and towards the corporate state. So there are, other ways of organizing fascism and preparing for the eventual coming to power. That, at least, is how they saw it.
And you've mentioned elites and the aristocracy. Best exemplified by the Astors, certainly Diana, Mosley's wife. When one reads about the British Union of Fascists, the aristocratic side of things, I always find it's really repulsive side of it. This sort of really no interest in democracy whatsoever. Is that right?
Well, certainly amongst the upper classes and aristocratic families, there was a great deal of sympathy for fascism. Now, this is partly just a reaction to what contemporaries understandably saw as the threat of communism. The success, so to speak, of the Bolshevik Revolution and its spreading influence, and the threat it posed to the British Empire and all the rest of it. So, and of course, when we got to the Second World War, many people out on the far right said, look, this is exactly what's happening, you see. And they said this, of course, after the war as well, that it's provided an opportunity for communism to spread its influence across Europe. Now, who's going to stop it? I.e., fascism is going to stop it. And that, of course, helps you to explain why, even in the first year of the Second World War, up to 1940, there was a great deal of, let's say, pro-Nazi sentiment among aristocrats and the upper classes, because they felt we shouldn't be fighting another war against Germany. We should be fighting the Russians.
And Alec, so what sort of themes do we get around that in the novel? All these different class structures.
Well, I think, to follow on with what Martin was saying as well, it goes to the top. If you look at Edward VIII, at the top of the apex of society, he had very pro-German views. He even made a comment, about, dictators seem to be quite popular in Europe. Maybe we'll have one here soon at some point. He and when after his abdication, he didn't get any better on that one. He had lots of Nazi and borderline Nazi friends, and Wallace Simpson was also suspected of having Nazi sympathies, and obviously we don't know, I don't think, about other members of the royal family because those files haven't been released anyway, as is well known. So no, I think it went to the top, and I think that's at the heart of the narrative of my book, is this notion that you have this crisis in December 1936, the abdication crisis, and Edward VIII faces a big dilemma, and the counterfactual is, could something different have happened with a kind of fascist hue to it? So yeah, no, that doesn't really answer your question.
Well, no, but I think it's something that novels are very good at drawing out. The Remains of the Day is really good at this. I think. I mean, whilst they're not sort of fascist, they're I don't think in the novel they're very sympathetic to Nazism.
It was very embarrassing for the royal family when the Second World War broke out, because it was discovered, of course, that, for example, the Lord Steward of the royal household, who was the Duke of Buccleuch, was in fact, he was a pro-Nazi, let's put it that way, and very keen on Hitler and so forth. So this was embarrassing, and the Duke did actually resign from that position. And the King appointed a new steward of the royal household, who was the Duke of Hamilton, whereupon it turned out that the next one was also rather sympathetic towards the Nazis and so forth. So now this doesn't mean that the new king was fascist at all. It simply indicates that in those circles, it was pro-Nazi sentiment was so common that it could be quite difficult to find people who genuinely had no connection or no sympathies with the Nazis at all.
And I was reading in the introduction of Hurrah for the Blackshirts, when you were looking through the documents of the time, is it the Dorset chapter of the British Union of Fascists is the only one surviving, I think? I didn't realise Dorset was such a hotbed of fascism.
You see, this is part of our problem in getting British fascism into a true perspective, because there's lots of primary material in the Public Record Office, but that material tends to be Home Office stuff that focuses heavily upon fighting and military, semi-military events in the big cities where the fascists got into trouble with communists and were pursuing anti-Semitic campaigns and so forth. But there's an awful lot of the country where things are much quieter, but where we don't have the same sort of evidence. And the example of the fascist in Dorset, which is in the University Library in Sheffield, is just a very unusual example of something that has survived from a rural location. But it's interesting that Mosley himself spent a lot of time in the 30s making speeches in small to medium-sized agricultural towns up and down the country, because he realized that the problems of farmers made them very susceptible to his economic appeal, just as he was appealing or trying to appeal to declining industries like cotton textiles. So he put a lot of effort into agricultural communities. But again, his meetings in these places were fairly quiet. There wasn't even much heckling or anything. They just listened to what he was saying. And so there's none of the formal records, except insofar as you can get reports in the local newspapers of what he said.
Was he on a bit of a hiding to nothing doing that? Because and the reason why I asked that is with our first past the post system of parliamentary democracy, it was unlikely he'd ever be elected. We've seen plenty of new parties rise that fail pretty quickly. Is this just another example of that?
Well, of course, we can't be sure, because the BUF's electoral appeal at a general election was never tested, although in the later 30s, Mosley was clearly planning to run something like 150 or more parliamentary candidates. But of course, the Second World War interrupted all this, so we don't know. He himself seems to have decided that he was going to stand in South Worcestershire, which is, largely agricultural. He obviously thought he had good chances there, when you might have expected that he would have gone for, somewhere, one of the big cities where the fascists had been pursuing anti-Semitic campaigns and so forth. But he seems to have been, as I say, focused more on one of these sorts of constituencies. So we just don't have enough evidence. But certainly, as you say, it would have been extremely difficult under our electoral system for a new party to win through. He would have had to have relied, obviously, on splitting the vote of the national government. And also, I think, and this is something else we forget, he would have tried to pull over some of the Labour vote, because quite a few Labour supporters did appreciate his economic strategy as well, his claims to be able to tackle unemployment. Definitely had a certain appeal on the left. So that's how he might have done it. He would have pulled together a certain amount of right wing and a certain amount of left wing support.
We've mentioned Edward VIII, and yeah. I just wanted to dive in to the whole what if. Martin, you're a historian. Listeners will be very bored of me asking historians if they're happy to talk what ifs. But let's assume, what's the best way of framing this, Alec? The what if, is it sort of around Edward VIII calling Stanley Baldwin's bluff and actually just going for it? And
yes, what if in December 1936, instead of abdicating as he was obliged to by Baldwin and Clement Attlee, leader of the opposition, who both refused to serve and form a government if he married Wallis Simpson. What if Edward VIII had, summoned the King's Party that many believe was starting to form and said, I'm going to call your bluff and I'm going to try and have my own regime. And, I think, would that have happened? Could it have happened? And could Mosley and the BUF form part of that? Is probably the big counterfactual question. That Martin, what do you think?
It's certainly true that if the king had not lost his nerve, and of course he did lose his nerve very quickly once he was under pressure, I mean, that crisis really only lasted about a week or 10 days before he backed down. But if he just stuck to his guns, yes. What he should have said was, he should have told Baldwin, "Oh, I'm not going to marry immediately. Okay, I'm just going to be king," because he would then have proceeded to his coronation. And once he'd proceeded to his coronation, he would have been much more difficult to shift, frankly. So he should have put the marriage to one side for the time being, being crowned king and then meanwhile, yes, I mean, he did have a King's Party forming, led by Churchill, plus, of course, the usual suspects in the press, that is Lord Rothermere of the Daily Mail and Lord Beaverbrook of the Daily Express. Now, if all these people had backed him at a general election, well, we don't know what would have happened, but there's no question that it would have split the vote of the national government dreadfully badly. And in the meanwhile, as I say, the king could have, if Baldwin had resigned, which was logical, he could have appointed Churchill as his replacement prime minister and then proceeded to the election. That's how it could have gone. And this is what a number of fascists were saying. They said, look at Italy. They said, monarchy and fascism go perfectly well together in Italy. We can do the same. That's what they were saying. We can go ahead with these two elements. That was actually quite clever in a way, because obviously Edward VIII was still a very popular man. There's no question about that. So if he had gone ahead on this basis, with Churchill perhaps as his prime minister, it wouldn't have been ideal, but it wouldn't have been totally impossible.
Just exploring that a little bit more, the Churchill of 1936 is not the Churchill of 1940, in that he hasn't had 4 more years of warning the country of what is possible in Nazi Germany, and which then comes to fruition in Nazi Germany. So is the Churchill of 1936 unlikely to have either held a majority in parliament or the support of the people, would that party have been doomed to fail?
Yeah. I don't think Churchill himself personally commanded that much support in the country at that time. It would have hung very much on the king. Edward VIII, as I say, was very, very popular indeed, and that would have been the key thing. If Churchill had been able to capitalize upon the fact that he was basically backing the king, a lot of people would have said, "Yeah, this is the kind of thing that we actually want." And I have to say that this is the sort of crisis that fascists were looking for. They were looking for some sort of big breakdown in the existing constitutional system. It might have been the general strike in 1926, but the abdication crisis in 36 did provide what they saw as potentially a very good opportunity, a crisis that the existing parliamentary politicians can't really handle. Therefore, it creates an opportunity for the fascists to step in. That's what they hoped, anyway.
And of course, they were going around. They launched a "Stand by the King" campaign during, and fascists were going around chanting 2, 4, 6, 8. The king must not abdicate, and all this stuff. But to go back to your counterfactual, Martin, if the king, he assembles this alternative government, and then he calls the election, well, that means we would have had an election, which we didn't have, because we had the national government. And then the fascists could have put 100, 150 candidates forward and potentially got enough to make a war for a king's party, which would then be fascist huge, which is a terrifying alternate reality, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, if fascists had got representation in that sort of crisis election, then they might well have done a deal with the existing, or some of the existing parliamentary leaders, and come into power in that way, because they were very well aware that both in Italy and Germany, Mussolini and Hitler had been, in effect, invited into power, and they were expecting to somehow be invited to take office at a time of crisis for the existing system, and that's what they were looking for, always looking out for a crisis which the conventional parties and politicians can't handle very well.
Where I think the counterfactual falls down, though, is that we're relying on Edward VIII here.
Yes,
and he's not. I wouldn't say he's not. He was known for his strong character, was he?
No, he didn't provide the resolute leadership that fascists really hoped for. He was a weak man and couldn't face up to it. Basically, he backed out. Yeah.
But it's a delicious thought, isn't it? They're 12 hours at Fort Belvedere on the 9th of December or in 1936 when, he basically lost his cool and decided, I can't deal with it, and I'm going to give in, throw in the towel. If there'd been someone else in the room, because I suspect that he was quite pliable to advice, if there'd been someone else in the room saying, come on, sire, you can do it. Just, another figure, perhaps wearing dark shaded clothing, it could have been different. Which is a horrifying thought. But and I think that's one of the joys of historical fiction, not writing history, Martin, is that you can play with these counterfactuals, and you can warn people that things could have been different, and we mustn't be complacent about the things we have now or the past. And if you imagine if Britain had a more pro-German government at that end of the 1930s, then the Second World War would have been very different, and the world would be different now.
Yes, certainly, that's true.
I just wanted to come back a little bit to the country being, I guess, ultimately answering your point there, Alec, is that how close it did come to it. In that, if fascism was a lot more prevalent than we perhaps appreciate now, and it's books like yours, Martin, that have helped in us understanding that actually it was a little bit more risky than we'd appreciated, then presumably there are other opportunities throughout the 30s when fascists the abdication crisis is the most obvious, but Are there any other opportunities that they could have had to strike?
Well, of course, the British Union of Fascists wasn't founded until 1932. So, of course, they missed the 1931 crisis when Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government broke down and was then replaced by the national government. That would have been an opportunity had they been in, because, of course, remember that in 1931, the King, then George V, of course, played an absolutely key role in suggesting anyway, a new prime minister and a national government. I think we do tend to forget this, that it was very much the King's intervention that led to the invitation to Ramsay MacDonald to lead the national government, and then to the Conservative leaders, Baldwin and others, to join it. We tend to forget what a role the King could play in these events if he was sufficiently, determined to sort the country out. And in that point, that King was, in complete contrast, really, to his son later on.
Do you think, Martin, if I last question, do you think George V was motivated in that moment by what he'd seen happening across the water in Italy and Germany? I mean, that would seem highly likely.
To be honest, George V didn't think much of other countries and their systems. He was very British and very patriotic, and I suspect that he wasn't thinking too much about other countries. He was looking at the material in front of him, and we often forget that the King rather liked Ramsay MacDonald, whereas he wasn't that keen on Baldwin. In the normal way, you might have expected that the King would have invited Baldwin to lead a new national government, but he didn't do that. As I say, he invited MacDonald, who'd after all been in power for 2.5 years with the Labour government. He invited MacDonald and then put, in a sense, there was pressure on the other parties to join in with him. So I think it's very much a homegrown effort on the part of the King. He's an interesting man, George V, because he made all sorts of really very important and influential decisions during his reign.
Not just a stamp collector.
Not just a stamp collector, no, indeed. No, he wasn't a stamp collector.
Talking about George V, Edward VIII, it's fascinating to think about. Actually, we're all led to believe that our head of state has quite a benign role, but actually, in moments of crisis, it's quite a crucial role.
Yes, it certainly can be. Incidentally, this is one of the points that many fascist organisations in this country used to make. British Mystery and British Array, for example, they were critical of the way the political parties and the politicians had kind of reduced the role of the King. And they said we ought to get back to an earlier part of British history when the King didn't just, he wasn't a figurehead who just launches ships and opens factories. He was a man with real power. And their argument often was that we want a more powerful, participating, resolute King.
And I just wanted to ask about the Public Order Act of 1936, because before listeners drift off to sleep, it doesn't sound particularly exciting, but actually it's a hugely important piece of legislation, isn't it?
Well, yes, of course, it is important because, of course, it is obviously an attempt to restrict fascist activities and in terms of restrict the appeal in terms of uniforms and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing to me is, in a way, that it took them such a long time to get round to this bit of legislation. Supposedly it was the violence associated with the notorious Olympia rally in 1934 that led them, but they were obviously a bit slow and a bit reluctant. And it's questionable, therefore, how much effect that act actually had on fascist activities. It's difficult to be sure because, of course, the BUF and Mosley were quite opportunistic and flexible in what they did and in the campaigns that they took on. So, for example, their Jewish campaigns in the East End of London, or anti-Jewish campaigns, were really able to continue much as before on the whole. And of course, as we approached the Second World War, Mosley launched a massive anti-war campaign. In other words, he went around the country addressing meetings, explaining that we should not fight against Germany again, that this is a mistake, that the French had led us into this sort of a war already in 1914, and we mustn't let them do it again. And of course, he blamed the Jews as well for leading us into a conflict with Germany. But that gave the fascists another really respectable sort of campaign, if you like. Mosley again addressed lots of big meetings on this theme without experiencing heckling and trouble and violence and all the rest of it, because a lot of people were inclined to agree with what he was saying, at least in the sense that they were very, very loath to embark upon another major war.
I was going to ask about fascism in France, because obviously Spain, Italy, and Germany are very well known for having their fascist parties and governments. Was this ever a prospect in France?
Well, I think perhaps not such a prospect, because of course the French were successful in promoting a popular front government, which was in a sense the obstacle to fascism. And incidentally, of course, there was a popular front campaign in Britain as well, in the 1930s, which was designed to, in a sense, push the national government in a more left-wing direction, if you like, and it did score a certain amount of success. But obviously, other countries, France and Spain and so forth, were really much more successful in the Popular Front movement.
Well, then in 1940, they're effectively shut down, aren't they? In May 1940,
yeah.
And that's it, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, pretty well in the public sense, yes.
Right. And I just wanted to get you, before we started recording, I'd mentioned I was keen to find out, because the word fascist is used all the time now. Everyone's a fascist, it seems. Anyone who doesn't agree with anyone else is a fascist. And before we were recording, Alec, you made an interesting point around the Trumpian government, it being a sort of pro-corporate type government, similar to a 1930s style fascist party. Is that am I getting that right?
I think if you look at what were the hallmarks of fascism in Britain in the 20s and 30s, nationalism, a strong, charismatic, resolute leader, a disregard for the legislature, and a disregard for judicial process. And I think you don't have to travel too far to begin to ask and point fingers and raise eyebrows. And I think that if you go on social media, you'll find many people who are prepared to call Donald Trump a fascist, and many who will probably revel in that, because they admire some of those qualities described. Whether the use of the word fascist as a kind of term of abuse has sadly diluted it, so that when you actually use the word to describe someone, rather than being a Conservative MP you don't like, who has a hardline attitude or something, oh, he's just a fascist, or someone in a coffee shop who doesn't get out of your way and does something different. But, the word is useful. It has been diluted. And of course, fascists don't look the same now. They don't wear black shirts and kind of breeches and walk around in jackboots. But there is possibly a uniform. And we've only just recently witnessed the Remembrance Day situation, and the counter protesters from the English Defence League were out in force. 100 people were arrested during acts of violence. There are definitely hard right politicians out there, and whether you call them fascists or not, it might take a Guardian leader to tell us what the answer to that question is. But I think if you look, for example, at the BUF, there was a man in the BUF called A.K. Chesterton, Martin. I know Martin will remember that. And then after the war, you spend 3 minutes on Wikipedia and you find yourself stepping through time. After the war, I think he set up something called the I don't know, the Empire League or something. But he then was involved with the formation of the National Front, which of course then merged in the 80s to become the BNP, which, don't forget, had 2 MEPs not so very long ago. And, and then today there's a whole, in the kind of internet, you find a whole swathe of far-right groups, of which the English Defence League is the largest. So there's plenty of these sorts of politics around, so we mustn't be complacent. But I've said that.
And Martin, do you see anything that you recognise from your studies in the 20s and 30s today?
It's hard to see anything that is quite as, well, I would have to say, intellectually powerful as the appeal that Mosley put across. And I'm thinking more of his economic program.
Yes, we've not really mentioned the appeal that he had.
He did have a lot of quite well thought out ideas about dealing with the economic depression and unemployment and so forth. And of course, he was in a strong position because he could say, well, look, I've been in the Conservative Party and I've been in the Labour Party, and I don't think either of them know how to deal with the economic depression. This is my alternative. And of course, quite a few of the ideas in his programme were supported by other people who were not fascists at all. Some of Lloyd George's ideas and Keynesian, what we would now call Keynesian ideas, have a good deal in common with the programme that Mosley put forward. So he did actually have quite a powerful argument to make, and he could make it because he was obviously a considerable orator. So I don't think we have really seen anything quite equivalent to that in recent times. We've no doubt seen other aspects of fascism, and obviously the reaction against parliamentary democracy is clearly a very continuous feature, isn't it, of these different movements. But I don't quite see the sort of central economic case being made.
Well, they're both. One thing they also have in common, though, is that economic protectionism. So Mosley believed in imperial preference and a degree of protection, and that's definitely a feature of certain governments' policies. And I suppose he would have chosen to keep us out of the Second World War. And isolationism is another feature of the sorts of governments we'll be talking about. It is, yeah.
I speak to people who there's one person I'm thinking in particular who's a very passionate Brexiteer, who often reminds me that Mosley was very keen on a united Europe, and that's an uncomfortable fact. But is my Brexiteer friend getting that completely wrong? And the EU bears no relation to the entity that Mosley was thinking of?
I think it's very different in the sense that obviously many of the people who had participated in the Second World War came out of it convinced that in the future we must find ways of ensuring that Germany and France never again fight one another as they have done now repeatedly with dreadful effects. I mean, there was that idealistic element behind the creation of initially the common market, as we used to call it, and then the European Union, which does seem quite a long way from Mosley's attitude towards different nationalities, I would have thought.
Yes, I like the way you phrased that, Martin. You're right. One thing that I got, we're nearly out of time, Martin, but one question I had for you was that I think a theme from the book I'm getting is that we were a bit complacent about the 30s. And do you think that a lot of people have described the last sort of 10 years or so as being very similar to the period in the 30s? Do you think that there's a risk of us being complacent against any such threats? We've just talked about, there's a lack of intellectual sort of vibrancy to current echoes of fascism. But are we seeing a sort of a repetition of the 1930s at the moment?
there are some similarities, and actually I would include the 1920s as well as the 1930s here, because there were lots of fascist organizations in this country then. Yes, I mean, the common points are surely a disillusionment with conventional politics and parties, some emphasis on the growth of, well, corruption in politics, which was definitely a theme of part of the 1920s there. And there are some, and a tendency, I suppose, to look abroad, to blame external, to find external enemies. Now, that is a common point, actually, isn't it, between today's politics and the interwar period. And of course, in the interwar period, what people were doing was, or some people were doing, was producing analyses of what they saw as a kind of international conspiracy by Jews to gain influence in the Western world, in the United States as well as Western Europe, which they saw as really subverting the traditions. Now, that sort of idea and analysis has definitely reappeared, but it tends to take the form of Islamophobia, the idea of that there is an international Muslim conspiracy that is subverting European traditions and European values and all the rest of it. Now, I would see as a major common point between the two periods.
We've also seen a huge rise just in the last few weeks of anti-Semitism as well, which we should, of course, guard against.
Well, that's true. That seems to have come back. Though, well, we can't. It's difficult to know whether that's going to be a long-term phenomenon, isn't it? One hopes that perhaps it's not. But yes, I mean, it's never disappeared altogether by any means, but it does tend to fluctuate according to international events.
And obviously, we've just had the Dutch elections, and Geert Wilders has won. His hard right party has won that election in Holland, and when we're talking earlier about fascist small f leaders, of course we have Vladimir Putin in Russia. I don't know, Martin, if you would care to use the label fascist for Putin, but he shares many of the qualities that we've described, or maybe we're debating the word.
Yes. I think I tend to be more concerned about countries like, or some of the leaders in a country like Poland, which, I mean, I know they've now had a change of government, and it looks as though they've narrowly moved away from a far right solution, which is quite a relief. But given that Poland is obviously part of the European Union, that seems to me a much more, in some sense, worrying feature than Putin and Russia. So we've got a bit of a mixture within the European Union, haven't we? With some countries lurching a bit to the right, but in other countries a reassertion of more progressive values. So I'm not quite sure where we're going, but obviously democracy is being challenged rather alarmingly in some places.
It's been a fascinating chat, Martin. I really enjoyed it. But Alec, so the other thing we've not mentioned, which is completely off topic, is Cromwell's head. Martin, have you got any theories of where Cromwell's head ended up?
No, I haven't. Sorry.
My mother would claim it's in her family, but
oh, grief.
Yes.
Well, I think most people believe it's near the chapel or in the chapel of Sydney, Sussex, Cambridge, where
those are lies, Alec. Those are lies.
Well, it could be a complete conspiracy. You're right.
Wonderful stuff. It's been really fantastic speaking. Thank you very much for your time.
That's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. You'll now be able to dominate any conversation on the subject and refer to this pod for any definition of an irritating fascist in your midst. Please do rate and subscribe and tell your friends. Coming up, I've got Vietnam and the My Lai massacre, but until then, thank you and good night.